In the year 1000 CE, Europe was a continent in darkness. Literacy was reserved for the few, roads had crumbled, trade had collapsed. The great cities of the ancient world were ruins or shadows of what they once were. The Roman Empire was gone, but something had taken its place. Not a government, not an army, not a king, a church. And in that darkness, the Catholic Church accumulated something that no institution before or since has ever matched. Not just wealth, total economic dominance. Today, we are going to follow the money through the darkest centuries in Western history and ask the question nobody asks: who got rich when everyone else was starving? Let us begin with land, because in the medieval world, land was everything. Land was food, land was shelter, land was power, land was survival, and the Catholic Church owned more of it than anyone else. By the year 1000 CE, historians estimate that the Church owned somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of all the cultivated land in Western Europe. 1/3 of an entire continent. Not purchased, not earned, accumulated. Through donations from dying kings who wanted prayers said for their souls. Through bequests from terrified nobles who feared purgatory. Through outright seizure from those condemned as heretics. Through centuries of accumulation by an institution that never died, never divided its inheritance among children, and never stopped acquiring. A human being lives and dies, their estate is divided, their wealth dispersed. The Church never died, it simply kept accumulating. Generation after generation, century after century, the land flowed in one direction, toward Rome. Now let us talk about what the Church did with that land. The peasants who worked church land were called serfs. They did not own the land they farmed. They were bound to it. They could not leave without permission. They could not marry without permission. And in exchange for the right to survive on church land, they owed the Church labor, a certain number of days per week working the Church's fields rather than their own. Produce, a share of everything they grew, everything they raised, everything they made, and the tithe, 10% of everything, on top of all the rest. A peasant family in medieval Europe might give 30 to 40% of everything they produced to the Church before they fed themselves. In a world where famine was a constant threat, where a bad harvest meant children starved, the Church was always fed. Now let us talk about the monasteries. By the 12th century, there were thousands of monasteries across Europe. And the monasteries were not just religious communities. They were the most sophisticated economic enterprises in the medieval world. The Cistercian monasteries, founded in 1098, became extraordinary engines of agricultural production. They drained swamps, they cleared forests, they built irrigation systems, they developed new farming techniques, and they did all of it with free labor. The monks themselves worked the land, and surrounding the monasteries were lay brothers, men who had given themselves to the monastery in exchange for food and shelter. Unpaid, working the most productive agricultural operations in Europe. The monasteries produced wool, wine, beer, grain, timber, iron, salt. They were not just feeding themselves, they were producing surplus and selling it in markets where they had extraordinary advantages over their competitors. They paid no taxes. They had access to the Church's legal protections. They could store grain across multiple locations and weather bad harvests that destroyed independent farmers. By the 12th century, the Cistercian order alone controlled agricultural operations across England, France, Germany, Spain, and Eastern Europe that would make a modern agribusiness corporation envious. All of it tax-free, all of it accumulating. Now let us talk about the banking system the Church built. The Church was the only institution in medieval Europe with the organizational sophistication, the record-keeping, the educated personnel, and the network of branches across the continent to operate what we would recognize as a banking system. The Knights Templar, a military order founded in 1119 with papal blessing, operated what was effectively the first international bank in European history. A pilgrim traveling from France to Jerusalem could deposit money with the Templars in Paris, receive a letter of credit, and withdraw funds from a Templar house in the Holy Land. No need to carry gold across dangerous roads. The Templars charged fees for this service, They made loans to kings. They held deposits for nobles. They financed the Crusades, and they grew extraordinarily rich. By the early 14th century, the Knights Templar were the most powerful financial institution in Europe, richer than most kings, which is precisely why in 1307, King Philip IV of France, who owed the Templars enormous sums of money, accused them of heresy. With the cooperation of Pope Clement V, the Templars were arrested across France in a single coordinated dawn raid. October 13th, 1307. The Templars were tortured into confessions of heresy. Their leaders were burned at the stake. The order was dissolved, and their assets were seized by the king who owed them money and the Pope who authorized the persecution. The most powerful bank in Europe was destroyed not because it was corrupt, but because it was too rich and too independent, and its wealth flowed to the institutions that destroyed it. Now let us talk about the most ingenious revenue stream the medieval church ever invented: purgatory. The doctrine of purgatory was formalized at the Second Council of Lyon in 1274. A middle place between heaven and hell, a place of purification where souls not quite holy enough for heaven were cleansed through suffering. The genius of purgatory from an economic perspective was not the doctrine itself. It was what the doctrine enabled. If your loved ones were in purgatory, suffering, and you could pay to reduce that suffering, what would you pay? Everything. You would pay everything you had. And the church was the only institution on earth authorized to accept the payment. Masses said for the dead, prayers purchased from monasteries, candles burned at specific altars, and eventually, indulgences. The medieval church built an entire economy around the dead, around the fear of what happened after death, around the love people felt for their parents, their children, their spouses who had gone before them. And every transaction flowed through Rome. Now let us talk about what happened when someone had something the church wanted and refused to give it: the interdict. When a lord or a king defied the church, the Pope could place their territory under interdict. All church services stopped. No masses, no baptisms, no marriages, no last rites. An entire population left spiritually unprotected because their ruler had crossed Rome. The pressure on the ruler from his own people was immediate and overwhelming, and when the interdict was lifted, when the ruler submitted, there was always a price. Land donated to the church, gold paid to Rome, rights and privileges surrendered to the local bishop. The interdict was not just a spiritual weapon, it was a negotiating tool, and the church used it to extract wealth from every corner of Europe for centuries. By the end of the medieval period, around 1500 CE, the Catholic Church's accumulated wealth was staggering. It owned an estimated 1/3 of all land in England, similar proportions across France, Germany, Italy, and Spain. Its annual income from tithes alone across Europe has been estimated by historians at the equivalent of billions of modern dollars. It operated the only functioning international financial network on the continent. It controlled education. It controlled record-keeping. It controlled the only institutions capable of sophisticated economic planning and management. The church was not just wealthy, it was the economy. In many parts of medieval Europe, every significant economic transaction passed through church hands in some form. Every birth, every marriage, every death. The church was there, collecting its fee. Now let us ask the question that ties all of this together. What happened to the poor? Because Jesus of Nazareth, the man whose name was on every church door, whose teachings were preached from every pulpit, said something very specific about the poor. Blessed are the poor. Sell everything you have and give to the poor. Whatever you do to the least of these, you do to me. The medieval church preached these words. It commissioned art depicting these words. It built its entire theological identity around the man who said these words. And then it built one of the most sophisticated wealth extraction systems in human history, extracting that wealth primarily from the people Jesus called blessed, the peasant who gave 30% of his harvest to the church while his children were hungry. The widow who purchased masses for her dead husband's soul with money she could not afford. The dying king who donated his estate to the church in terror of purgatory, leaving his heirs with nothing. The church did not ignore the poor, it commodified them. It turned their fear, their grief, their love for their dead, their terror of hell, into revenue for 1,000 years, and called it salvation. The Dark Ages were dark for most people, but not for the institution that owned a third of the continent. For them, it was the greatest period of wealth accumulation in Western history. You have been watching Unmasking the Gods. The church owned a third of Europe, built the first international bank, invented Purgatory as a revenue stream, used interdicts as negotiating tools, and extracted 30 to 40% of peasant income in a world where famine was a constant reality. Blessed are the poor. The institution built in his name made sure there were plenty of them. Subscribe, leave a comment. Tell me what you want to unmask next. And remember, the gods were never what they told you, but what they actually are is worth everything.